Anyone who works in healthcare has at least a few spooky stories to tell. So for the Fall for Magnum PI Campfire, I'm going to share a few of those with you. The specialty I work in, unfortunately, involves a lot of work within palliative care. And one morning I was on a ward round to review my palliative and end-of-life patients. We had a patient who had a very poor prognosis in one of the side rooms, perhaps just a few days at that point. But for reasons I won't go into here, they only had visitors in the late afternoons and early evenings, so during the day there was never anybody, friends or family, with them. I planned to review this patient, but if they were asleep, I didn't want to disturb them, so before I went into their room, I peeked through the window in their door, and I was quite surprised to see a man, an elderly gent, sitting in the chair beside their bed. He was perhaps in his 70s or 80s and dressed very smartly in a brown tweed suit. I thought perhaps he might want to speak to me, so I knocked on the door and walked into the room. I closed the door behind me, and when I looked up, he was gone. There was nobody in the chair and nobody in the room but the patient and myself. The second story, I was quite a new graduate, and I was on a night shift on a care of the elderly ward. I was sitting at the nurses' station, and I think the two nurses on duty were in the medication room at the time, so I was completely alone. To the right of the nurses' station was a ladies' bay, and to the left the men's. I was sitting at the computer, and I suddenly heard this lady's voice say out loud, "Excuse me." So I looked up and saw an old lady wearing a white nightgown with pink flowers on it, and she was peeking around the corner of the bay at me. I got up to see what she wanted, but as I did so, she completely disappeared. I searched the entire bay and I couldn't find anyone matching her description, either walking around or in any of the beds, and all of the patients were fast asleep. The final story, I was working for a few months at a hospital in the north of England, and there was one particular part of this hospital that I absolutely hated. There was one unit that made me feel very uncomfortable. It was a rather old Victorian inner city hospital, but it was a new build that used to make me feel very uneasy. The patient areas weren't so bad, but the back corridor of this unit, where the staff rooms and storage rooms were, had an oddly eerie atmosphere to them. You often felt as if someone were walking directly behind you, and occasionally you'd hear whispers or mumbling. I found out shortly before I came back to London that that particular part of the hospital had been built over the area where they'd found the body of one of the Yorkshire Ripper's murder victims.
Okay, so my ghost story is from Christmas 2012, and my friend at the time had previously, earlier in the year, bought a Ouija board for her partner, and for some reason it was at her house, and we decided at 11 o'clock at night we were going to set up the Ouija board and have a go. We were sitting at a square table, and we were both on each side of the corner of the table, and we had a half circle of candles in front of us. So there was no possible way that there could be shadows on the other side. Well, there was. We had asked it what year it was from, and then all of a sudden, massive shadows were bouncing across the walls, and I will never mess with bad juju and Ouija board ever again. Never been so terrified in my life.